Good morning, everyone. I see a lot of you have already been able to join us, so I'll make a start. Um, Wanting to wish everyone a very warm welcome to this online policy dialogue on resettlement and complementary pathways, which way forward. We're again very happy to be able to welcome so many of you this morning. We have over 140 registrations. Our event today is the third and unfortunately also the final event in a series of 3 events that we've been holding in the context of the MEDAM project. MEDAM, short for the Mercator Dialogue on Asylum and Migration, is a project that EPC is conducting jointly with the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the European University Institute in Florence. It is supported by the Mercator Foundation. All 3 events in our series, and also a key focus of the project generally, look at different aspects of EU-Africa cooperation on migration. We explore ways to ensure that cooperation is genuine, meaningful, and mutually beneficial. Our first event looked at cooperation around labor migration. We had a second event 2 weeks ago on return and readmission. And today, as mentioned, we turn to the topic of resettlement and complementary pathways. Resettlement policies have, of course, long been recognized as a tool for durably offering protection to the most vulnerable, and also, importantly, as a way for Europe to showcase solidarity with those countries hosting the largest number of refugees. We know that worldwide, the vast majority of refugees are indeed hosted outside of the European Union, and that global resettlement needs are high and continue increasing. At the moment, UNHCR estimates them at around 1.44 million. At the same time, international players that were historically strong resettlement actors, such as the US and Australia, have been diminishing their commitments. Against this background, clearly Europe has a strong role to fulfill. This was also recognized and highlighted in the Commission's new pact on migration and asylum that was presented on 23 September. And we'll learn more about that new pact also from our panelists, but amongst other things, the Commission recommended, firstly, Member States to resettle 29,500 vulnerable people over the course of 2020 and 2021, plus also to scale up these efforts in future. It also called for a swift adoption of the EU resettlement framework proposal, aimed at moving EU resettlement schemes from their currently more ad hoc nature into a more sustainable and structural setting. It also invited member states to contribute to a new EU approach to community sponsorship, also called private sponsorship. Will these initiatives be enough? And already touching on a few elements and questions that we will be looking at, amongst others, are these resettlement quota sufficient? So certain international organizations and NGOs have already highlighted that 29,500 resettlement quota is actually a relatively low number when we compare it to how large the needs globally really are. So again, the figure there is 1.44 million. What are the prospects for scaling up these efforts? What are the prospects as well for the swift adoption of an EU resettlement framework? Also, are European initiatives in this area supporting African states as effectively as possible? If not, what more can be done to make sure that our efforts are really effectively being directed to those places where the needs are the greatest? What exactly also can a European Union approach to community sponsorship look like? How can we ensure that the added value of localized initiatives remains really fully present? A final but also important element that I believe we'll be touching up on in some depth today include questions on how both European and African states can move forward with resettlement efforts in the face of severe travel restrictions and, of course, heightened and additional health security concerns raised by COVID-19. So, for instance, what is the future for new initiatives like remote interviewing? So I've touched on some, but surely not all of the questions and elements we'll be looking at in more depth over the next 75 minutes with our distinguished panel. I'm very happy to welcome with us today, to begin with, Laura Corrado, who's joining us from the European Commission, DG Home, where she's head of the Legal Pathways and Integration Unit. We also have Annabelle Mwangi with us. Annabelle is a Senior Durable Solutions Officer with UNHCR's Nairobi office. And we also have Giulio Di Blasi, Director for Europe at the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. Unfortunately, and he makes his excuses, Peter Mudungwe from the African Union Commission, who was scheduled to join us as well, had to cancel his participation last minute. Before passing the floor rather to the speakers, some very brief household notes. This is a public discussion. It's also being recorded, so just so everyone is aware of that. Each speaker will have around 8 to 10 minutes for their opening statements, and I will immediately move to the discussion with our audience as well, so that we can have a lively Q&A debate this morning. You're invited to submit your questions to us initially in writing, and then I'll also invite you to present your questions orally. You can do so by using the chat function that you can see on your screens. I would like to ask you to please keep your questions as short and to the point as possible, and then we can have as many of them as we can manage. That's all from my side for now, and I'm very pleased to pass the floor to our first speaker, Laura Corrado, for her opening statements.
Thank you, Marie, and good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me well and that the connection will remain stable. Otherwise, I'll have to switch off the video, but for now, it seems to work. I'm very glad to be here to talk about resettlement and complementary pathways. It's something that it's very important to our commissioner and also to me personally, and it's something that will be a priority for the Commission for the future. So just to put it into the frame, of course, you are all aware of the Migration Pact, which we issued on the 23rd of September. Of course, the attention there was more about the asylum proposal, the asylum reform, the return sponsorship, the solidarity mechanism, and all the rest. But I want to stress that the legal pathways pillar is also very important in the context of the Migration Pact. And it's an element on which the Commission intends to work in the months ahead. And when I talk about legal pathways, it's not only, of course, for people in need of protection, resettlement, and other complementary pathways, but also for people that are coming for work or for other reasons. We have announced a skills and talent package for 2021, which will entail a number of also legislative proposals to revise some of our acquis, and also non-legislative proposals, such as exploring options for a talent pool. So this is just to stress that this is legal pathways, it's an important pillar and will remain so, and we will discuss this in the next months with the member states, with the European Parliament, and with all stakeholders. We have a public consultation also open on that, which is running until the end of December, and we would be happy to get feedback, of course. Now, coming to the subject of the discussion today, which is the pathways for people in need of protection, starting with resettlement, of course. One of the elements of the Migration Pact is our recommendation on resettlement, humanitarian admission, and complementary pathways. The objective for this recommendation was in the first place to set the frame, to put into a frame the pledges for 2020. So the almost 30,000 pledges for 2020, to give them a framework. Of course, as Marie stressed, this might seem not up to expectations or needs especially, but it's an important contribution from the EU side to the global needs. And clearly, we have to take into account that COVID has impacted a lot also on resettlement, as on all other aspects of migration or of traveling and mobility more generally, obviously. And therefore, the implementation of these pledges is clearly not as we would have expected at the beginning of the year. We have over 4,000 people that have practically arrived, though there are 6,000 still in the pipeline, I would say, whose applications are processed and that should come in the near future. And this is also why we have extended the implementation period of the 30,000 pledges throughout 2021. So to allow member states really to actually implement these pledges with more time, given the situation. We have also said to member states that we will look if they consider that they will be able to have implement additional pledges in 2021. We will look also at the possibility for a top-up of funding. Of course, we are at the end of this financial period and we will need to see what is possible, but we have already told member states that we are open to consider that, provided, of course, that they are able to implement first the 2020 pledges and then they have the capacity to implement additional ones. So this is what we have discussed with the member states so far. We have had recently a discussion in the resettlement network, which was very, very interesting, because I would like to also stress that in spite of the challenges of the COVID impact, also on resettlement, many member states have really worked towards finding very creative solutions and innovative solutions. And you mentioned something, Marie, like remote interviewing or on dossier examination of applications. I mean, there are many member states that have done this and that have tried to still not disrupt entirely the operations, even if people could not travel for a period, but they have tried to process the applications, to do pre-departure training and so on, not to disrupt entirely the operation. And this is very positive. Of course, we have been supporting them, and the EASO, the asylum agencies, has supported that. We have had a number of discussion and exchanges in the last months on these topics and on the practical implementation of resettlement in these circumstances. But I have to say that overall, we are quite pleased about what was done by our member states in the difficult circumstances. There is a willingness to resume operations, in spite and as far as possible, of course, but in spite of the difficult situation. So I would say this is a positive point already when it comes to resettlement. Now, for the future, clearly we have confirmed the ambition in our resettlement recommendation to really embark in a path of growing resettlement for the years to come. So this is certainly the ambition, and we will have new resources, fresh resources in the next multi-annual financial framework. And this is, the EU will continue to support member states as regard resettlement. You have mentioned, Marie, also the resettlement framework. Of course, this is a proposal which is still pending, and on which we would still hope to have an agreement, not this year, because this is not likely for the moment, given the negotiations on and the discussion on the elements. But next year, we would like to have an agreement as soon as possible on the resettlement framework, so that then we will have a more stable framework as regards the planning also of resettlement for the next years. But in any case, even we have seen that even without the framework, we are able to plan and to have pledges. This will not be something that will prevent us from resettling or from having EU pledges, but of course it would provide a more stable and predictable framework. So this is when it comes to resettlement. We have made also a number of recommendations on ensuring the quality of resettlement programs, on monitoring, but I would say these are a bit the main elements. Now, the most innovative elements of the communication, the recommendation, are indeed the other aspects on top of resettlement, on which we have recommended member states to take action and to develop these pathways. We talk about humanitarian admission and of other complementary pathways. So humanitarian admissions, it's in the first place. There are different examples, in fact, in member states. There are, for example, the humanitarian corridors that we have seen in Italy, for example, or in France. Or we have examples of family-based sponsorships. And there we have family sponsorship programs which are quite broad, that go beyond the definition, strict definition of family members as we have in our directives, but are quite enlarged. And there are member states like Germany that have this family-based sponsorship program. So we are encouraging member states really to implement broadly such programs. And then besides this, we have also encouraged member states to develop complementary pathways for study and for work for people in need of protection. Again, we have had a discussion also recently with member states about this, on complementary pathways, and exchanges practices about existing programs. And we have seen that, for example, in Portugal, we have examples of student pathways. In that sense, we have in Italy also, we have these university corridors also, a sort of adaptation of the humanitarian corridors. And this is also something that on which, of course, the UNHCR, and I guess our colleague will tell us more, is working actively, and we are working with them. There is the task force on the, in particular, on the student pathways to which we are associated as Commission. So we have had very interesting exchanges on this with the member states, and we will continue to do so in the near future to see how this can be further developed. Now, for labor pathways, it is true that we have less experience on the EU level, but there we are looking at what is happening, for example, in Canada, and they have really recently developed a program. I think maybe Giulio can tell us more, or others can tell us more this about the program that they have developed for employment pathways for beneficiaries of international protection. There are organizations like Talent Beyond Boundaries, for example, that have developed such pathways also with Canada, but also UK and Australia, and we are also looking at these models. And we will need to see, of course, how all of this fits with our also EU models and acquis. But I mean, we are confident that these programs can be developed in the future with without needing radical adjustments in any case in terms of the legislations. And this, we will continue to support the member states in that sense. Now, another important element that we have mentioned also in the recommendation and on which we want to work is community sponsorship. This is something that also our commissioner, she's really keen in developing this and in developing a European model on community sponsorship. Again, there is Canada with a precursor on this, as of many other things, but we have also some examples in member states of community sponsorship schemes, whereby, again, civil society has a very important role, not only in preparing the admission of people, but especially in the integration phase, in the reception and integration into the community of beneficiaries of international protection. And this is something which has proved to be very effective, also in terms of integration outcome and inclusion in the society, and therefore is something on which we want to work more with the member states. There are some examples also on the EU that already exist. This I leave to Giulio to expand on, but it's something on which we also want to promote. And in that sense, and also together with EASO, in that sense, we have already also financed some projects on that should be implemented from 2021. So 5 projects have been financed through the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund on private sponsorship or community sponsorship and resettlement. And they will be implemented as of 2021. We will have an event together with the German presidency and EASO on the 25th of November on community sponsorship as well, to discuss further the issue with the member states and other actors. And also in terms also financial support from the EU, not only to member states, because these projects are transnational projects for civil society organization in partnership with, of course, the authorities, but really they aim at supporting especially non-governmental organizations. We have launched also a call mid-October on complementary pathways. So to develop projects on complementary pathways that can be family sponsorships for study, for work, both to expand existing projects or to develop new ones. And this is also something that we would like to continue to support also directly to the civil society side. So I think I have made a bit an overview of everything that is in our resettlement recommendation. Of course, as I said, it remains also important for us to have the resettlement framework regulation adopted, because this is not only for resettlement, but it will also codify at least the humanitarian admission side. That is also important, and there will be lump sums also for humanitarian admissions from member states once this is adopted, and it will allow for have more predictability in the resettlement process. Voila, so I will conclude here, but of course I'm very happy to reply to questions on the one or the other point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, for a very comprehensive overview indeed. for also highlighting the importance of complementary pathways beyond resettlements, and very interesting to learn as well how the Commission is looking at other global players and for instance, the policies of Canada and Australia for new initiatives in the pipeline. I'll be happy to move over to Annabelle Mwangi. Very briefly to our audience, don't hesitate to already put your questions in writing into the chat. But so over now to Annabelle, who is joining us from Nairobi with UNHCR's office
there. Thank you so much, Marie, and thank you again for the invitation to participate in this panel today. 2020 has been a very difficult year on so many levels. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a disaster for people from all walks of life, but has been especially difficult for the world's most vulnerable, who include refugees and other displaced people. As the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic emerged earlier this year, many of us felt a sense of apprehension about what would happen when it reached Africa, with observers expressing serious concerns over the combination of overstretched and underfunded health systems. Those of us working with refugees recognize that the economic strain, xenophobia, and discrimination resulting from the pandemic could potentially slow the momentum towards the inclusion of refugees in health and social protection systems, and also in economies as envisioned in the Global Compact on Refugees. From our perspective, we have made significant strides on the inclusion agenda on the African continent over the last few years, and several countries have implemented the comprehensive refugee response framework. Just by way of example, in Uganda, the health sector integrated refugee response plan guides service delivery in refugee hosting districts. UNHCR, as well as refugees, are represented on the Global Fund country coordination mechanism. Refugees are included in HIV/AIDS, malaria, TB, and nutrition programs, and 72% of health facilities that are accessed by refugees are government-owned, with medicines and supplies delivered by the government, and health work is also seconded by the government. Refugees are fully integrated into the national preparedness and response plans, activities, and fundings. In Rwanda, meanwhile, urban refugees have been included in the national community-based health insurance schemes. They're considered a special category, but they pay the same premium rate as nationals. And when the COVID-19 lockdown began in Rwanda in March of this year, about 78% of urban refugees were already enrolled into the CBHI program and were able to benefit from health services provided by the government. So we do have some very good examples of refugees being included in national systems, and we are hoping to be able to continue to take these forward. Thankfully, the pandemic has not had the catastrophic impact that was initially predicted in Africa. On September the 29th, the world passed the 1 million reported death mark, but on the same day, the count for Africa was a cumulative total of 35,950 deaths. So the emerging picture is that in many African countries, transmission has been higher, but the severity and mortality has been much lower than originally predicted based on experiences in China and Europe. Now, that being said, from the perspective of UNHCR working in Africa, we continue to feel the impact of COVID-19 on our operations and on populations of concern on a day-to-day basis, and we remain extremely vigilant. Resettlement processing was hard hit by the pandemic, and COVID-19 had serious impact on border closures and both international and domestic travel restrictions, and resulted in work from home modalities for many of our staff. In the Eastern Horn of Africa region, which is where I work, we moved quickly to put in place systems to ensure the continuity of resettlement processing, as well as, very importantly, to provide safety nets for those individuals whose scheduled departures were delayed, in particular those under emergency or urgent priorities. We established remote processing mechanisms, as has been mentioned already, in several countries, but I must emphasize that this was no easy task. The remote interviewing mechanisms included, for example, three-way Skype Business or Microsoft Teams video links, using accounts which we set up for the interviewer, the interpreter, and the refugee. So, for example, staff would connect to Skype or Microsoft Teams from their residences or from a UNHCR office. Interpreters would connect from a separate office in UNHCR premises, and refugees would connect from yet another office in the UNHCR premise. Entrances to UNHCR compounds for all individuals, including refugees, staff, security guards, interpreters, etc., were set up in compliance with COVID-19 preventive measures, which included the use of PPEs, temperature checks, and hand washing facilities. We also developed remote interviewing checklists for use by staff to ensure that safeguard measures were being consistently applied. And to avoid overcrowded offices and to maintain social distancing, the number of cases that were scheduled for interview on any one day were reduced. So in principle, we would have one interview of a family per day in most locations, but this obviously significantly reduced our processing capacity. Adapting these remote processing mechanisms was no easy feat and has had significant budgetary implications for us as well. We also had to reconsider how to adapt some of the most basic components of procedures relating to resettlement processing, which are potentially issues that you might not necessarily consider initially when you talk about new systems being put into place. So for example, we had to consider the risk of contamination. So what happens when refugees use shared pens when signing a declaration page, or potentially the risk of contamination during biometric checks, which we systematically implement as anti-fraud procedures, with refugees using finger pads multiple times, or the exposure risks for refugees who would be traveling in public transport to the interview site. We work to enhance communication with refugees in the resettlement pipeline using community-based mechanisms, but also through new technologies. So in Burundi, for example, a website which is accessible to all refugees concerned with updates on resettlement processing and related activities has been set up. And this site allows refugees not only to consult on the status of their cases in the processing pipeline, but also gives important updates, for example, COVID-19 related information or anti-fraud messaging in 3 language options that are relevant to refugees in that particular context. It also allows refugees to send specific requests to UNHCR for follow-up on their individual cases. In Kenya, another example, the resettlement team uses SMS through an application called Mighty Text, as well as WhatsApp to enhance communication with persons in the resettlement pipeline. So Mighty Text is a web-based application that allows the user to access messages on a phone and to send out text from that number. And the use of WhatsApp, meanwhile, allowed refugees to send key documents required for processing their resettlement referrals through the social media application to address movement restrictions in the camps. I have to underscore, and I think it was already mentioned by Laura, that during this period, resettlement countries, including EU member states, remained very engaged with UNHCR to find ways to keep resettlement programs running. So refugees with emergency protection needs have been able to depart, including in some instances using charter flights hired to evacuate country nationals, and innovative modalities have been adopted to maintain resettlement processing in the absence of in-person selection missions. So one country recently, for example, has been able to conduct remote interviews in Ethiopia via video calls directly from their capital. So perhaps maybe a few points on the way forward, combined, I think, with some key asks from our side. As UNHCR, well, we recognize that the 3-year strategy's goal for 70,000 refugees to be resettled globally in 2020 will not be met. We do ask that states do everything possible to meet agreed upon arrival targets for the year, whether by the end of 2020 or into 21, but not at the expense of commitments for 2021. We also note that the European Commission's support will be critical to increasing the number of EU resettlement states, as well as to supporting capacity building for countries outside of the EU who might be willing to establish resettlement programs. From our side, we remain committed to supporting this process and would be happy to, for example, organize virtual missions to key host countries to facilitate a better understanding of refugees' needs for both resettlement countries and receiving municipalities. The EU funding of resettlement processing, including through supporting NGO resettlement deployment schemes, remains an essential contribution. for our purposes, in light of the fluctuations in quota allocations, many operations in Africa rely heavily on deployment schemes. And one of the biggest challenges that we faced at the onset of COVID-19 was staffing capacity, with many deployee contracts ending in June, as staffing had initially been allocated with the aim of front-loading our submissions in the first half of the year. And in this regard, again, many of our partners were extremely flexible and supported us in the extension of contracts for these deployees to facilitate continuity of processing. I think it's also important to emphasize that resettlement remains an important protection tool on the African continent. And this is in a context where many states in Africa have hosted protracted refugee populations for decades. Resettlement is very important and can contribute significantly to efforts to enhance the protection space for persons remaining in countries of asylum. In Africa specifically, almost 670,000 of the 1.4 million number that you mentioned earlier are estimated to be in need of resettlement. And this reflects the numerous protracted situations across the continent, such as those of Congolese, Eritreans, and Somalians, as well as the ongoing instability in countries such as South Sudan and mixed migration flows across the Sahel region. So in the spirit of solidarity and burden sharing envisioned by the Global Compact, we note the importance of prioritizing access to resettlement for refugees along the central Mediterranean route, as well as in comprehensive refugee response framework countries in our region. In this regard, perhaps just to take the opportunity to share our appreciation for funding from the EU and member states for the emergency transit mechanisms, but also to note the need going forward to consider the allocation of additional places for unaccompanied minors and separated children. As many of you may be aware, in the ETMs, in Rwanda, for example, almost half of the current population is registered as unaccompanied minors. And in addition, we would call upon member states to expedite departures from the ETMs to facilitate additional convoys from Libya, which are now possible. Laura had mentioned complementary pathways, and from our perspective, we are also looking at how we can expand access to complementary pathways for refugees on the continent. So in the Eastern Horn of Africa region, we've recently undertaken a comprehensive survey across 10 countries to identify both entry points and barriers to accessing complementary pathways. As part of the survey, we noted the need to improve data collection and coordination between different actors working on complementary pathways, and to enhance support services. And by support services, I mean access to documentation, facilitation of exit permits, legal assistance, etc. And we believe that EU member states can support in strengthening capacities in these enabling areas as well. More broadly, we would also call upon EU countries to consider how they can support access to complementary pathways at the regional level, as well as within the EU, in collaboration with academia or foundations and the private sector, etc. The EAC and ECOWAS free movement frameworks, as well as the forthcoming African Union Protocol on Free Movement, may provide useful opportunities for the expansion of education and labor mobility pathways for refugees on the continent. And then finally, maybe just to say, at the recent Global Refugee Forum, which was hosted by UNHCR in December 2019, nearly 1,400 pledges were received, of which about 130 explicitly related to resettlement and complementary pathways. So we would very much encourage pledging states to work closely with UNHCR, both at the global and the regional level, to identify opportunities for matching some of these global pledges, specifically those on complementary pathways. We would also encourage better coordination to maximize the impact of some of the individual pledges that were made by member states as well as other stakeholders. So, for example, in our region, we're working to identify complementarities between existing complementary pathways projects that show capacity to scale, and GRF pledges that were made on the upskilling of refugees in countries of asylum, the provision of legal assistance and labour mobility pathways, as well as access to financial services. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I think I took a bit longer than anticipated, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabelle. No worries, and thank you for a very interesting overview of how resettlement governments is also looking like on the African continent, some of the challenges faced, including in the context of COVID-19, and the interesting pointers as well on what the way forward should look like. Without further ado, over to Giulio, who is joining us from the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. Giulio, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Marie. And if there's any issue with the voice, please flag and I will turn down the video. So I would start maybe by saying what GRSI is. I mean, very often people may not yet know. So GRSI is a bit of a weird animal, is a multi-stakeholder partnership between the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the Canadian government, the University of Ottawa, and 3 private foundations, Open Society, Justra Foundation, and Shapiro Foundation. And the goal of this partnership is to expand and promote community sponsorship across the world. Sponsorship, in our understanding, is a form of citizens' welcome, where a group of people coalesce together around a welcoming opportunity for a resettled refugee. Essentially, it works in a very fascinating way. The group comes together, they put together an integration plan for a refugee to be resettled, they submit it to the state, they are trained and supported, and then once the family of refugees arrive, they are really at the forefront of the integration work. So they help them go to the grocery shop, they help them to go into schools, they find them a house, they help them to get a job, and ultimately they really create the kind of community support around their integration. What is interesting is that that's available.
I'm coming in because I do think there's an issue with the sound there now.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Maybe it's better with no video. See if it works. So what I was saying is, so how this welcome works is that it creates the kind of wraparound support to the integration that goes from grocery shopping all the way down to integrating kids in school. And very interestingly, it realizes 2 objectives. One, it accelerates and improves the integration outcomes. And the second is that it has positive impact on the communities themselves. So it really helps shifting narratives at community level on refugee support. It's a form of welcome that is practiced in Canada since 40 years, and over 300,000 refugees were welcomed in Canada through community sponsorship, which means that millions of Canadian citizens have actually been involved into this kind of welcome, almost 30% of the Canadian population. And what is really exciting for us is that now over 14 countries around the world are implementing sponsorship programs. So that's to give a little bit of the background on sponsorship and GRSI itself. Now, where do we see us and where do we see sponsorship moving forward? As this, I think, is the key question around for today. So sponsorship is, we believe, more important than ever on 3 dimensions. First, it will grow the places for resettlement. I mean, with 1.4 million resettlees in waiting, we are in dire need to increase the reception opportunities. We all know how reception centers are overcrowded, and therefore increasing the number of places is a core objective for sponsorship. The second is to address narratives, so to help to address the narrative challenge that Europe and other countries face around refugees. And we see incredible impact in the countries where sponsorship is activated when it comes to shifting the perception and the narratives at community level. And the third, of course, is to increase the integration outcome for refugees. I mean, we all know how integration is a crucial topic for Europe. The Commission is going to come soon with an integration action plan, sponsorship improving the integration outcomes. Of course, there are tons of challenges surrounded due to COVID. First and foremost, the non-arrival of refugees. So we have hundreds of groups around Europe that are waiting for the refugees to arrive, and they need to keep up motivation while all the work they did to prepare for the arrival cannot be fulfilled. But it's a short-term challenge. And on the other side, we think that sponsorship is even more relevant into a COVID context for the narrative reason I spoke about, but even more importantly, we hear from the groups that are hosting refugees at the moment how it has been important for refugees to have, even if it's in a virtual format, the kind of wraparound support sponsorship offers at the time when in-person meeting cannot happen. So for a newcomer family that comes to a new country and can't even go out of the home because it's in quarantine or because there is a lockdown, to have a community to refer to that helps them even at this challenging time is even more important than ever. Where are we working moving forward is essentially we're working around 3 pillars. One is to increase the number of countries that are involved in sponsorship. The second is to scale the number of sponsors in the countries that are already implementing sponsorship. And the third is to connect sponsorship to several pathways. So at the moment, sponsorship in Europe is mostly linked to resettlement, but there are incredible opportunities, as Laura was already mentioning, to link it to student pathways, education, to labor pathways, and even to family pathways. Actually, in Canada, the vast majority of sponsorship happens through family pathways. So we are working on these three dimensions all together, which means on one side to bring into the refugee field the kind of organizing capabilities that are a little bit outside of the traditional refugee field knowledge and organization. I think here of social media capacity, I think here of mobilization capacity, but also, for instance, to bring in the refugee space organizations that are not accustomed to be there. An example here is library clubs or sports clubs that can be mobilized to be part of the hosting opportunity for refugees. And the second dimension, as I said, is to work on linking to more pathways. And as Laura was already mentioning, there are very interesting new programs emerging in Italy, in the UK, in Canada, but also in other European countries. So these two dimensions mutually reinforce the scale opportunity, because it will scale the number of refugees that come, but also scale the number of sponsors that are ready to welcome and host refugees. And the new pact has been really a crucial milestone from our point of view in Europe. It has been a crucial milestone because it stresses the importance of sponsorship and resources sponsorship, but it also links sponsorship to all the different pathways. And now there are really important opportunities moving forward with the revision of the legal migration directives to integrate a refugee protection dimension into the new legal migration directives and make the legal migration directives, let's say, more flexible in view of integrating complementary pathways. But also, this links very much to a global leadership role for the European Union. And here is where I'm concluding. Of course, I think we are all looking with one eye at the conference and the other eye at what happens in Washington. But there is a really important opportunity coming up for global leadership to be expressed in the refugee space. And this is not only a leadership in terms of numbers, it's also a leadership in terms of modalities and quality and innovation. And the innovation goes through things like sponsorship, complementary pathways, but also financial innovation. There have been a lot of discussion about possible resettlement bonds and how can private-public partnerships increase the spaces for refugees to come. Digital innovation. So there is an incredible wealth of opportunity for Europe to be on the leading front. The pact offers the starting point for that. And we would look forward to work together with the European institutions, with member states, in order to make sure that Europe is part of that leadership moving forward.
Thank you very much, Giulio, for a very rich insight into community sponsorship schemes, state of affairs, challenges, including in the context of COVID and way forward. I'll move immediately into the Q&A, and we have quite a few interesting questions, for which many thanks that have already come our way. Laura, unfortunately, needs to leave us a bit earlier, so I will be prioritizing the questions that have been directed to Laura first. I'll be taking 3 to 4 questions at a time, and then we'll have the next rounds to follow up. I'll mention the participants whose question will be brought forward, and then our colleagues from the events team will unmute you. If you could please introduce yourself very briefly, and then also raise your questions. Also, please do keep your questions to the point as possible, so we can bring many in. Starting with the very first question that we have received from Mr. Matthias Rutte. Matthias Rutte, the floor is yours.
Hello, good. And nice to see all of you. I was asking myself, Laura, probably you can answer that. What are the chances of the resettlement framework regulation to get adopted ahead of the overall package in terms of asylum and migration, or whether this will be again part of an overall package? And if that's the case, what are the chances of adding some of the elements of the recommendation into this regulation in terms of opening up to what Julia was talking in terms also of private pathways and sponsorships. I know that some of it is already there, but it would be great to hear a little bit more about that. And great to see you again. Thanks.
Many thanks. Over to Petra Huuk for a next question.
Yes, good morning. Yeah, like Julia was saying, we are all looking with one head to the US elections and the other one at the screen. So apologies for the typos in my question. Well, Laura, I think we have discussed this already before. Of course, there's a lot of blending happening between resettlement and community-based sponsorships. And one takes often place in the context of the other program. When we talk about your pledges, the pledges and the lump sums, how effectively will you be able to monitor how these programs are effectively growing within resettlement and are really adding the places that are so urgently needed? So about monitoring and assessing that, and on the basis of what criteria would be even, yeah, that would be also, of course, very interesting to hear. Thanks, and hello to everyone.
Many thanks, Petra. I'll take two further questions and then I'll move over to Laura and our other panelists, of course. The next question is by Theodora Ispos, and then we'll move over to Katharina Bammer. So Theodora, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question. I just wanted to ask Ms. Corrado, we've seen in the last few years that the biggest issue with resettlement has been the lack of solidarity between member states. And I was just wondering if in the new pact there is a mechanism which will allow the Commission to maybe, find some sort of penalty against member states who do not respect their pledges. We've seen that happen quite a lot, and that is clearly an issue that needs to be addressed. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, and many thanks for keeping it brief. Over to Katharina for the last question in this round, but we'll have next rounds to come. Katharina?
Yes, hi. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Quick question to Laura as well, and I think it's also something that Julia has mentioned before. I would just like to know, how can community sponsorships be linked to legal labor migration pathways specifically? And do you already have a plan for this in the upcoming package on legal labor migration? Thanks.
Many thanks for these 4 very interesting questions. As mentioned, I'll first go to Laura and then, of course, also to our other panelists. Laura, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks. Thanks very much for the good questions, and good to see you again, Matthias and Petra, and all well-known faces. Yes, I mean, I will start from the difficult one, so the link with the package to the other measures, and particularly the asylum-related measures. Well, there is certainly a link between the resettlement framework regulation and especially some of the elements of the package, in premise the Eurodac regulation. And this has been made very clear by the Council and by the German presidency that they don't see how to reach an agreement on this resettlement framework without having Eurodac adopted. Eurodac, which we have also now slightly modified, because there will also be data about beneficiaries and allows to monitor secondary movements. And there is a fear, founded or not, of member states of also secondary movement of resettled refugees, although this is certainly not the target group which is more likely to, to move irregularly to other member states. But there is a concern on the Council side, so certainly it is linked to Eurodac as a minimum. And then there are political linkages to others. So yes, we risk being a bit hostage of this discussion, but we would still, and so this year it will not be possible, obviously, but we would still hope that we can give it a push at some point next year, maybe, if then there's a decision to advance on the proposals that are less controversial. So Eurodac and the Asylum Agency, this is not totally excluded that on some of these, there could be an agreement while pending the discussion on solidarity responsibility. Of course, it's very political, it's difficult to foresee. So about including some additional elements, namely those that are in the resettlement recommendations on community sponsorship and so on, well, this would be a bit risky in the sense that we would risk reopening a provisional agreement that had already happened between the co-legislator on the resettlement framework. So I'm not sure. It depends maybe for how long we will have to wait for an agreement to be reached on the resettlement regulation, and if it's clear that this cannot happen soon next year, maybe we can consider additional changes. But for the moment, this is not in the plan of the Commission or of the co-legislator. But it's a valid point, certainly, and we will see what happens a bit next year. Then on the monitoring of the pledges, well, we have also included provisions in the recommendation to strengthen monitoring. So not only about resettlement, but also that member states should inform us regularly of complementary pathways. Of course, this in financial terms, these are lump sum incentives, so member states don't have to report as for other cost-based, I would say, financing. But of course, we have also the resettlement network, which is also a place together with EASO where we can see actually the progress made, which you can see how member states implement the pledges and so on. So this will also be together with EASO a place where we can better monitor what happens on resettlement in the practical implementation. On the question of the lack of solidarity, I think it was meant maybe rather in relation to relocations between member states. I think the question was about the member state not respecting their pledges. So as regards relocation, which is of course another very difficult discussion. Now we have proposed a different system with the Migration Pact, where relocation is, solidarity is mandatory, but relocation is one of the elements of this mandatory solidarity. There are also others that can be put at disposal of other member states. As regards resettlements, it is and it remains based on voluntary commitments from member states. And what we do is really to provide incentives through, of course, financing, lump sum, and also through supporting cooperation and exchange of practices with other member states. Then on the last question, the connection, community sponsorship and the legal pathways. At the moment, as I said, we have started a discussion with the member states on this. At the moment, we don't see a need for amending the legal framework in that respect, but it's an element because there are programs already developed on complementary pathways that can take place within the flexibility allowed within the EU legislation and the national legislation. So we don't see an issue with the programs that have been developed, for example, for students. But it's something that we will examine, and Giulio mentioned we will have to revise some legislation. I mean, not all the legislative acquis. It's a question that we will further examine whether any adaptation is needed. But for the moment, we are really working to see how these programs can be developed without major modifications of the legal framework. And then we will see. I would say this is more for the medium, longer term to see whether we need any adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Over to Giulio and or Annabelle. Please do comment, both of you, if you want to add something. Giulio,
yeah,
please.
I mean, I would like to add on a couple of things, starting from the last Laura mentioned. I mean, and also to answer on the question, do we need legislative modification for sponsorship to support other pathways? So overall, we don't think we need legislative modification for sponsorship to underpin other pathways. Actually, to the opposite, sponsorship helps solving for some of the key challenges that normally happen in other pathways. I give you an example. On labor pathways, the refugee comes in, and in some instances, he may come in on a work visa and not on a refugee visa, which means that he may have less of a structured integration system. And having sponsorship linked to that pathway helps to solve for the integration question, because you will have actually an integration project linked to the labor visa for a refugee. So sponsorship helps to solve for some of the challenges that may be linked to the development of complementary pathways. Again, the analysis needs to be done pathway by pathway and country by country. It's impossible to do it really across the board and overall. But what we see is that really sponsorship can help to solve for the integration linked to the pathway, regardless of the pathway. And actually, there are very interesting experiences already existing across the world. I mean, I make the example, for instance, of GMESTIL in Canada, which I really advise everyone to look at. He is a big entrepreneur in Canada. He has already welcomed around 400 refugees as part of a labor pathway. Actually, people come to work in his company, and the employees of the company mobilize around the welcoming opportunity. So it really feels, it really fits two different objectives. One is the community support and being an inclusive company, and the other is offering a pathway to refugees in a way that also fosters the objectives of the company, because these people are going there to work. So it's not that that the company has a lose in any possible way. So there are incredible examples already existing on how sponsorship and labor pathways connect. The sponsorship dimension doesn't require, we think, major legislative changes of any kind. The pathway dimension may, and that's where, I mean, I think with Laura, we will need to continue all together to examine really in details. For instance, documentation that is required to refugees, not always refugees have the same access to documentation than other migrants, and so on and so forth. So whether there are requirements that need to be made a little bit more flexible to accommodate refugees in legal migration pathways. But again, I think it's an open question moving forward, which kind of legislative tweaks are actually needed. A very last point I wanted to make, because I forgot before and Katerina reminded me, even though not asking for it. One other dimension we're really looking at is what cities and local authorities can do in the framework of sponsorship. We see amazing opportunities there to link the willingness of cities to become more welcoming and the potential for them to be mobilizers to create new groups of sponsors in countries where sponsorship already exists. And in terms of more rural authorities, we already have, for instance, the example in the Basque countries where a more, let's say, peripheral region has used sponsorship to land refugees and to integrate them in a way that has reduced dramatically secondary movements. So before, the Basques were trying to welcome refugees in resettlement, but there was a lot of secondary movements out of it. And now their experience is much more positive by using sponsorship, as refugees really get ingrained into the local community and tend to stay. So these two dimensions are also very relevant for us looking forward in the European work.
Many thanks for this, Giulio. I'll ask Annabelle if she also wants to come in, but Laura will need to leave in a few moments. So Annabelle, very quickly to you, if you wanted to add something to what has been said, then please don't hesitate to come in. And if not, we'll move to one or two more questions for Laura before she needs to go.
Thanks, Marie. I just wanted to maybe very quickly highlight some key considerations from the perspective of the work we do in countries of asylum when setting up labor pathways. So maybe just to highlight that, of course, this process is very resource intensive, and in order to be successful, it's important to invest in capacity building both in the receiving countries, but also in the countries of asylum. We need to develop clear communication strategies to ensure that refugees are actually aware of some of these opportunities as they arise. And we also need to enhance identification capacities. And in this regard, it would be important to have a clear agreement on the types of skills profiles that resettlement countries, receiving countries are looking for, and to provide legal counseling for refugees who are under consideration on what their rights would be in the receiving country, on their legal status, as Giulio mentioned. And we would need to ensure protection mechanisms are in place in the receiving countries. And finally, perhaps to consider the barriers that are in place in host countries that might prevent access to these labor mobility pathways. So yeah, I just wanted to flag those few issues. Thank you.
Many thanks. I'll move quickly to two further questions to Laura. First, going to Bernard Ostrop and then to Gabriella. Please both keep them very short so that Laura still has a chance to answer. Bernard, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask Laura, you mentioned that you want to increase resettlement. Wouldn't it be necessary to increase the lump sums for the member states instead of reducing them? Because reducing seems to be planned within the new AMIF. And second question, shouldn't the Commission think about more incentives also for the host communities? These are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you for keeping them short. Over to Gabriella, who has a question for both Giulio and Laura, but we'll then first go to Laura. Please, Gabriella.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for the very interesting discussion. Yes, indeed, my question is for both Giulio and Laura with regards to community sponsorship. One of the things that usually comes up when we talk about community sponsorship and the sponsorship group taking more responsibility for the integration of the participants of the program, I was just wondering how you would work with member states as you expand sponsorship to different pathways, how you could work with them to ensure that they don't forgo their responsibility for sustained government investment in integration services and tailored support for refugees.
Many thanks. Over to Laura for answers to these two questions. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Marie. First of all, about the lump sum and resettlement. Yes, indeed, it is true that in the context of the current discussion on the new Asylum and Migration Fund, the German presidency and the Council has proposed to reduce the lump sum slightly and to make distinction between vulnerable and non-vulnerable. The Commission is not in favor of that. For the moment, we do stick to our proposal of keeping the 10,000. Increasing, it's difficult in the current, in the future budget, because we have also, of course, to support and finance the solidarity mechanism, also with the Asylum Migration Fund, so for relocation, return sponsorships, and so on, under the thematic facility. So increasing is not feasible, but we as Commission, we want to keep the 10,000 and we are not in favor of reducing them. Now we need to see how the negotiations will end up on the MFF more generally and on the Asylum Migration Fund. Then when it comes to the host communities, well, of course, I mean, as I said, the lump sum, it's an incentive sum, does not cover all cost. But member states also can use, and they do use also, their national programs under the Asylum and Migration Fund, and also others, actually, even the Social Fund, to foster what is more the reception and the integration part of resettlement. So this they can and should do, and they will, and this we will remain available, of course, also through, not necessarily with the lump sums. And as I mentioned, we have made also a number of calls for proposals. I mentioned those on community sponsorship and those upcoming on complementary pathways, but we also finance a number of projects with priorities on integration, access to services, to health, or integration of women that of course are also relevant for the integration part of the resettlement and community sponsorship. So we also finance directly the civil society organizations with our direct funding. And then about, yes, the work with the member states and the community sponsorship. Yes, this is exactly what we mean also when we talk about the European model of community sponsorship, taking into account we have a European acquis, first on legislation on asylum. We have our welfare state model, if we can call it like that. So of course, this does not mean that member states do not have to comply with their obligations. They do, they will have to comply based on the EU legislation, on their system. But we also see community sponsorship as something that complements that. I mean, the obligation of the member states, but has the advantage of also empowering, as Giulio explained very well, the civil society, the host communities, and so on. I do apologize that I have to leave these interesting debates, but unfortunately there are other obligations. Thanks very much to all for this, and enjoy the rest of the discussion. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Laura. Thank you. And we do understand that your agenda is limited. Thank you for very interesting insights. I'll continue discussion by moving over to Giulio, who also was directed in one of the questions.
Thanks a lot. Yes, I'll try to very quickly answer to both. So on the first one, just to flag, I mean, I mentioned very quickly on the lump sums, a very quick reflection on the opportunity also to leverage private capital in the space of resettlement. I mean, there are some very interesting studies, for instance, from the Center for Development in the US on resettlement bonds, and how can we create private-public cooperation that allows the maximization of the amount of funds that are available in the resettlement space. So that I think is very interesting also to look at if we want to have a ambition at the European level to really increase the numbers. A second thing more on sponsorship and how the states do not forgo responsibility or forgo investment. I mean, honestly, in our experience so far at all, the state has not actually saved money out of sponsorship in any possible way. Mostly there has been a shift in the way money is spent by the state. So for instance, instead of paying directly for some things, they have a new organization that trains the sponsors. So this is not really about saving money. It's about improving the integration outcomes and the way integration is actually managed. Of course, the government remains ultimately responsible in case of sponsorship breakdowns. I mean, in Europe, we didn't yet have a sponsorship breakdown. In Canada, they happen in less than 1% of the sponsorship groups. But of course, there may be a case where the sponsorship groups, for some reasons, fall apart, and the state remains responsible for the resettled refugee. What is also very interesting from our point of view is that in the European context, of course, welfare is a major consideration in all states. So access to welfare remains absolutely equivalent for refugees that are resettled through sponsorship or not through sponsorship. And of course, governments remain also in charge of quality assurance. So as I was saying, sponsor groups is not something where a group of people come together and just one day say, tomorrow I want to have a refugee coming, but it involves a lot of training and also safeguarding and quality assurance that is performed either by the state or by a authority delegated by the state. Very often is traditional and very experienced CSOs that perform quality assurance on the sponsor plans and confirm that the group that is being selected is ready to welcome a refugee. So actually, to the opposite, we think and we hope actually that the investment in sponsorship will lead to a snowballing of opportunities for refugees. And I mean, just to give you a very interesting example we came across recently is in the UK, for instance, sponsor groups right now are at the forefront of calling up for the reopening of resettlement because they want to continue welcoming refugees. And we think this is a very good example on how the creation of this constituency by way of sponsorship is also going to make the refugee welcoming and resettlement systems more resilient in the long term.
Many thanks, Giulio. Annabelle, would you like to add a few words to any of the comments made here? Or yeah, please do feel free to come in if so.
Nothing from my side. Thank you so much.
No worries. We still have very few minutes, but also still interesting questions. So I'll take 2 short questions still for a very final round before we unfortunately will need to wrap up. I'll go to Caroline Pop first. Caroline?
Yes, can you hear me? Good morning.
Yes, but you'll have to speak up a bit because the sound is quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much for the discussion. Yeah, I also had a question for very much. I'm just interested in your practical view of how the connection between sponsorship programs and, say, labor or education pathways would work, what it would look like. I understand the integration component, about the legal component.
Thank you, Caroline. The sound was quite bad, unfortunately, so I'm also going to read out the way you formulated your question for full clarity to everyone. So you asked, so what would linking sponsorship to labor or education pathways really practically look like, and if our panelists can elaborate. Thank you for that question. Over to a next question to Olivia Sundberg-Diaz. Olivia, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank all panelists for excellent contributions. I'm a policy analyst here at the EPC. One question for UNHCR primarily. I wondered, in your experience, whether EU resettlement efforts are being effectively directed to where they are most needed, and where do you think that EU efforts could better address the greatest needs? We've seen a shift in recent years towards resettlement potentially being used more as a migration management tool rather than primarily a humanitarian instrument. This is potentially included in the resettlement framework and possibly in some elements of conditionality in the new pact. So is there a risk of it moving further away from its role as a humanitarian instrument, or is it effectively targeting needs as you see it? Many thanks.
Many thanks to both. Following the order of the questions, I'll first go to Giulio for brief comments because we're short in time on the first question, and then to Annabelle for her comments on the second question. Giulio, the floor is yours.
I will be very fast also because I'm not sure I understood fully the question because of the sound issues. But for what I understand, the question is about how do we ensure the legal framework around complementary pathways and sponsorship. Actually, it's a very interesting question. And there are, I mean, I would really invite everyone, it's very interesting reading to read the EMPP evaluation from Canada. So Canada has already implemented the labor pathway. And there is an evaluation already available online on the previous version that is really looking at all these kind of dimensions. And I think one of the most interesting questions relates in particular to the rights of refugees coming through a complementary pathway using a legal migration visa. So if you would come as a skilled migrant, for instance, but you have the needs of a refugee. And that is a fundamental point of the policy design work that needs to happen country by country, and we are looking forward to support in order to make sure that the pathway design linked to sponsorship responds to these legal questions. Again, which requires analysis country by country, pathway by pathway, case by case. It can't be generalized, but what is certainly generalizable is that designing legal pathways is something that requires answering the kind of legal rights questions, access to welfare, access to education, and so on and so forth, because refugees accessing those pathways will not have the same needs as a migrant, as a economic migrant accessing the same pathway. So again, I know it's unsatisfactory, but it requires at least so much of an individual case analysis that is difficult to provide a global answer beyond, yes, this is a very good question and needs to be answered pathway by pathway.
Thank you, Giulio. Over to you, Annabelle.
Thanks very much, Marie. Yeah, so maybe just to say, I think the most important thing from our perspective is to really ensure that the needs of refugees across all regions are effectively addressed. So in this context, we have noticed that at specific points in time, obviously the interest in supporting resettlement for particular refugee populations tends to shift according to political priorities. So for a long time, there was a focus on the Syrian population when we had the uptake of movements from Syria to Europe. And this did have, unfortunately, an impact on other refugee populations that did also require resettlement. So I think one priority would be really to emphasize the need to consistently be addressing resettlement needs across all regions. And indeed, we note the need as well to prioritize the protection dimension when it comes to resettlement. So we've had a lot of discussions around complementary pathways, and we see this as a very important component of being able to provide protection and solutions for refugees. But unfortunately, it's important to underscore that complementary pathways often prioritize skills or education and not necessarily the most vulnerable populations. So while this is an important dimension, when we talk about resettlement, we do very much need to focus on protection needs and the needs of the most vulnerable. I think another challenge that we've been facing recently is the increasing emphasis on the integration potential of refugees when identifying populations for resettlement consideration. And while we understand the importance of refugees being effectively able to integrate in the country of asylum, this often does mean that those who are most in need of resettlement might be bypassed. So maybe just to say, we do think that there are significant efforts in place to ensure that needs are being effectively met. We recognize that the places that are available don't match the needs, but these are quite significant, and it would also be important when scaling up to scale up gradually, because I think the worst thing that you can do is to really increase the numbers arriving in resettlement countries and then not be able to integrate them effectively, because that would then potentially lead to some backlash on that side. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Annabelle, for indeed also very important final remarks there. Unfortunately, the clock has hit 11:15, and that's the end of what I believe has been a very rich discussion. I would like to thank our panelists very warmly for all of their insights, and our audience, of course, as well, for very interesting questions. And I wish you all a very nice day still.